where I think we should be heading, which is gender-inclusive policy design. So I was really interested in researching the book and writing it. I was inspired by universal design, sometimes referred to as inclusive design, and not the liberal kind, which is just make the sort of the more commercial aspect of it, but the more thoughtful kind version of it, which I think starts with the question of who's the least well off by a given policy, like who's in the worst position with respect to sex-marked transit cards, for example. And somebody like Charlene Arcilla would be a good example of somebody who is constantly hassled. And then moving from the needs, designing around the needs of that group of people, and then making things better for all of us. And I think that there's potential for that to happen with gender in our societies. So gender-inclusive policy design would take the opposite approach that we have right now. So we assume that a lot of our social customs around gender, all the application forms that we fill out, I just filled out, I have 2 little kids, I just filled out the daycare application for next fall, and there was a question about boy or girl. And I'm willing to be convinced that you have a legitimate reason to ask me about this, but what I want to see happen is for that explanation to be given transparently on the form itself, and for the default to be not to ask at all. So don't assume that the social custom of just asking on every form about gender is the way that we should go, but do the opposite. Okay, so here's an example of what that might look like. Strangely enough, this is a Medicare card. Medicare and Medicaid last April got rid of the sex markers on their identity cards. And I believe this has happened with social insurance number cards as well. Yeah, here. And curiously enough, the National Center for Transgender Equality they were working to get this passed for a long time, were able to get this pretty radical change to happen, given our political climate in the US right now. It's pretty remarkable. So it goes to tell you, administrative policies, it's a labyrinth of a lot of different agencies and different things happening, and real change can come about. So what I think is important here is that, again, there's no real reason for asking or for displaying sex or gender on the card. Okay, so what I propose in the book, and you have an example of a gender audit that I conducted with a large investment bank in New York City, the results of that in the appendix to the book for people to have a look. But this is basically asking the question, when and where is sex or gender used in a policy? And I think that this is a really important exercise for any organization to undergo, where you're asking, number one, taking stock. It's an introspective process. A lot of us are not even aware of when and where sex and gender appear in policies. And I think that the default, again, should be to abolish the sex classification policy if it isn't necessary, and if it's necessary, to make the case for why. Just some takeaways, and we'll open it up for your comments and questions. Sex classification policies always trigger sex identity discrimination. And this does not mean that we should get rid of every single sex classification policy. I actually think there are some examples where they're legitimate, and we can talk about that. But in those cases, you still have sex identity discrimination. You just have a benefit that's sort of outweighing that discrimination. And that we could talk about sex-based affirmative action policies, I think, are in this category. And there are some other examples too. And also, just as a takeaway that I hope you'll think about with gender-inclusive policy design, that it helps trans people, but it also helps a lot of non-trans people. And that is the next step that I would love to see us move in terms of companies and organizations and government in our society, to see that this issue is not one that just impacts a tiny percentage of the population, but it's actually much greater. And you could be negatively impacted in ways that maybe you haven't even thought about.